All right, good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the late start to this event. We had a couple logistical challenges when one meeting ended and another began with this. So I'd like to invite you all to the technical briefing on chemicals, health, and a non-toxic circular economy. We're joined online with several individuals. I believe over 100 people had registered for this from different parts of the world, which is not bad for a Sunday. We have a distinguished panel, and if we go to the first slide, I will walk you through what this program looks like today. My name is Bjorn Bieler. I'm the International Coordinator for the International Pollutants Elimination Network, also known as IPEN. The opening, we had learned that Sheikh Sila, the host country lead for this, is also now representing Africa on the Bureau, which is taking place now. So the result of the Africa regional meeting is that Sheikh Sila will be the Africa representative, which does not allow him to give the opening comment, as you can see. So with that, what we will have is a technical briefing by Dr. Leo Trasande, speaking about the health impacts of chemicals and plastics. Then we will have a briefing from Griffin Zochen, the co-chair of the IPEN Toxic Plastic Working Group, talking about data from the South. And then we will have a panel discussion. So I appreciate everyone who's online and for staying with us for this late start. If it's late at night, I appreciate that even more. So with that, I'll pass it over to Dr. Leo Trasande to begin the session.
Thank you, distinguished country representatives. Thank you, guests online. It's a privilege and honor to be here. My name is Leo Trasande. I'm a pediatrician and epidemiologist at the New York University Grossman School of Medicine. And I'm also here representing the Endocrine Society. And I'll explain the role of the Endocrine Society in this issue of plastics, EDCs, and health. So we can go to the next slide, please. So the main takeaways in today's presentation are that we know that many chemicals that are used in the manufacture of plastic materials interfere with hormone function and thereby contribute to disease and disability. The evidence here is clear and unequivocal. It's extensive. With consequences that span the entire life course from cradle to grave. And we know that the health and economic impacts are profound and life-threatening. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. So just as background, the Endocrine Society is the world's largest, oldest, and most active organization speaking out about the impact of hormones, our signaling molecules, and on our health. It's a group of scientists and clinicians that are involved in the practice of endocrinology, and it includes over 18,000 members from over 100 countries across the globe. We'll go to the next slide, please. So endocrine disrupting chemicals are synthetic chemicals that hack our natural molecular signals, our hormones. And because our hormones underlie every basic biological function from temperature, metabolism, salt, sugar, and even sex, the effects are profound. And these chemicals were not appreciated as problems because we originally thought everything in moderation would be fine, something that is akin to what you may have heard from the Swiss philosopher Paracelsus, only the dose makes the thing a poison. Unfortunately, we now understand that little things matter, and low levels of many of the synthetic chemicals I'll be talking about today are present in all of us and contributing to disease and disability at the lowest levels of exposure. And that's terribly important to keep in mind. And so the list of chemicals you see here are among the best known endocrine disrupting chemicals today. And many of these chemicals are used in plastic materials. Next slide. So the science here is extremely strong, and it's accelerated over 2 decades. I'm privileged to say that the Endocrine Society has been a leader in this space with the first scientific report on this issue in 2009. Not long thereafter, the World Health Organization and the United Nations Environment Program in 2012 published the report on the right, documenting this issue as a global public health threat. Next slide, please. This report was welcomed by the participant countries at the 2015 Strategic Alliance for International Chemicals Management, and not long thereafter, the Endocrine Society published a second scientific report putting particular emphasis on the health effects, not just identified in the laboratory, but the consequences for human health. I just want to emphasize how hard it is for a scientific society to come up with 2 statements in 6 years. That really speaks to the movement and growth of the literature, particularly causing for alarm. Next slide, please. In addition, there is broader mainstream recognition. We're talking about the obstetricians and gynecologists who have put patient-facing information about endocrine-disrupting chemicals. My own U.S. American Academy of Pediatrics has put particular emphasis on chemicals unintentionally and intentionally added to food, including chemicals used in plastic materials. And the World Obesity Federation has put particular emphasis on the impact of policy in terms of reducing exposures that independently contribute to the obesity and diabetes twin pandemics that we're dealing with today. Next slide, please. So plastics are a crucial source of endocrine disrupting chemicals. They're not the entire planet of EDCs, but there are 5 categories of chemicals I'm going to be emphasizing in this presentation. We're talking about bisphenols used in polycarbonate plastics and aluminum can linings, which really are plastic. Phthalates used in plastic food packaging, the soft and crinkly type in particular. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, used in nonstick cooking and fluoropolymer plastics. And brominated flame retardants are an under-recognized and important additive to prevent flammability, yet there are health consequences that are serious. And I want to emphasize the problem with burning plastics, which is often posed as a solution. They create dioxins, some of the most unfortunately well-known synthetic chemicals of concern, particularly as carcinogens. We'll go to the next slide, please. So we know the most about the effects of synthetic chemicals and endocrine disrupting chemicals used in plastics on the developing brains of young children. Thyroid hormone is especially crucial for brain development, and the baby relies on mom's hormone through the 2nd trimester of pregnancy. And even in the clinically normal range, this isn't something a women's healthcare provider can detect. Synthetic chemicals can hack thyroid hormone such that growth factor for the developing brains of young children can ultimately be disrupted in a way that contributes not just to cognitive deficits, but autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And we know that brominated flame retardants have chemical structures similar to thyroid hormone. Now, it's not just that brominated flame retardants interfere with thyroid hormone, they also reduce the functioning or production of thyroid hormone. Next slide. We know that brominated flame retardants have been consistently associated with decreases in cognitive functioning in children, and this is from across the globe, US and Spain, just to name a few examples. But this evidence is continuing to grow and be consistent in its findings. Next slide, please. We also know of 50 or so chemical obesogens, chemicals that make us fatter. And these are particularly chemicals used in plastic. Nothing here I'm going to say minimizes the importance of healthy diet and physical activity in combating the obesity and diabetes pandemic. But the more we study obesity, we realize there's a 3rd leg to that stool, and that's synthetic chemicals that hack our metabolism and contribute to greater weight gain and insulin resistance in particular. Next slide, please. Bisphenols are a broader category. You've probably heard the most attention to bisphenol A or BPA. It makes fat cells bigger, disrupts the function of a protein that protects the heart called adiponectin, and is a low-grade synthetic estrogen, so it can have sex-specific effects on body mass. And a theme throughout this presentation that I'm not going to give justice is, as we've gotten attention on BPA, we've moved that out and see BPA-free products, but we see whack-a-mole happening in which replacements that are equally, if not more harmful are used instead. One prototype for that is bisphenol S, or BPS, which is as estrogenic, as toxic to embryos, and as persistent in the environment. Next slide. Phthalates have a host of effects. They either antagonize the male sex hormone, testosterone, and they also are known to disrupt lipid and carbohydrate metabolism through the expression of genes in our body. So nothing here suggests that we're changing the genetic code. What we now realize is that environmental exposures upregulate and downregulate genes contributing to disease and disability. Next slide. We know also that bisphenol A is contributing to cardiovascular mortality. This is terribly important to emphasize given the substantial drive and focus on non-communicable diseases. We know that BPA reduces the size, the flow of blood up to the brain in the form of carotid intimal medial thickness. It is associated with worse coronary artery disease and has also been associated, quite frankly, with mortality from cardiovascular disease. Next slide. The same is unfortunately true for phthalates. Phthalates, as I emphasized before, hack our testosterone function in men in particular, and this has been shown in multiple studies. And we know that phthalate exposure is also associated with all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. And as a theme I'll get to at the end of the presentation, these unintended consequences of chemical exposure from plastic materials not only cost our human health, but cost our economy. In the US alone, we've estimated over $40 billion in lost economic productivity due to early cardiovascular disease in the form of heart attacks and stroke. Next slide. We know that perfluoroalkyl substances are these nonstick substances that if I measured all your blood today, each of your bloods, and gave you the test result, you would 9 to 10 out of 10 would have detectable levels of these chemicals in our bodies. And that's because these come in the form of food packaging and oil and water resistant clothing, as well as nonstick cooking materials. Next slide. We know that PFAS restrict fetal growth, thereby setting the baby up for a what we call thrifty phenotype to retain calories as much as possible in response to that growth restriction, thereby contributing to increases in childhood overweight. Next slide. We also know that PFAS contribute to adult weight gain and diabetes. PFAS slow the resting metabolic rate in adults that have lost weight through healthy diet and good physical activity. And in multiple studies, they've been associated with new onset diabetes across the globe. Next slide. We know that phthalates and other EDCs affect fertility, our ability to have children. Now, fertility is clearly a product of a couple. The vast majority of the literature has focused on male factor infertility. We know that phthalate exposure during pregnancy can affect a little boy's ability to reproduce. There's a marker called anogenital distance. That reduction in anogenital distance suggests less testosterone exposure in utero. And that reduced testosterone exposure has consequences all the way to adulthood in the form of reduced semen count. And we know that it's not just the phthalates that contribute to reduced fertility. We're including bisphenols and perfluoroalkyl substances that have been identified in relationship to reduced sperm count and other markers of fertility. Next slide. We know that the burden of disease and costs of EDCs are substantial. Some will argue that there's controversy about this, but we did a series of studies in 2015 and 2016 supported by the Endocrine Society in which we reviewed the associations with the greatest scientific evidence and even applied rigorous criteria to identify the probability of causation. And based upon the level of uncertainty, we reduced the cost further to account for uncertainty, looking across 15 exposure outcome associations. And we looked first in the European Union and then in the US. Next slide. And what we found is that in Europe alone, the costs of EDCs were 157 billion euro. That's 1.2% of the gross domestic product. And that's based on fewer than 5% of the known EDCs, a subset of the diseases due to the few chemicals we studied, and a subset of costs due to the few diseases due to the few chemicals we studied. And yet, Despite this being an underestimate of an underestimate of an underestimate, the costs were 1% of GDP in Europe. And that's profoundly driven, as you can see in the next slide, by plastic materials. The phthalates, bisphenols, and flame retardants were substantial drivers of costs identified in Europe. In the US, the pattern was even more unfortunate, next slide, with costs of $340 billion. That's 2.3% of our US gross domestic product. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that flame retardants and plastics are the chief drivers of these exposures, because in the United States, we didn't proactively regulate flame retardants as well as they were regulated in Europe. And so policies predict exposures, exposures contribute to disease, and disease ultimately costs us all. So the next slide is, I believe, by way of closure. But I'll first say that PFAS also contributes substantially to low birth weight in young children. A global estimate recently suggested over 400,000 low birth weight babies are born each year as a result of preventable PFAS exposure, a substantial amount of which is from plastic. Next slide. So to summarize, we know that plastic additives interfere with hormone functioning and thereby contribute to disease and disability. This evidence is clear and extensive, and the health and economic impacts are profound and life-threatening. And I'll refer you to the IPEN Endocrine Society joint report on plastics, EDC, and health. It's a wonderful resource for further information. And I'll go to the next slide, and thank you for the opportunity to present here today.
Thank you, Dr. Trisande. And just as a reminder, we're talking about known hazardous chemicals put into plastic products today. We heard BPA, bisphenols. We've heard PFAS. We've heard brominated flame retardants. When you buy a plastic product, it will typically not name these ingredients. How do you find out what's in the plastics? Which introduces us to our next speaker, Griffin Zochen. He is the Executive Director for the Center for Environment and Justice and Development in Kenya. He is also, within IPEN as a network, he is also a co-chair for the IPEN Working Group on Toxic Plastics. And now we'll get into how do you find out where these chemicals are from the data that we've generated in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which is where you typically do not find data. So it's very important for these regions to have access to data. So I'll pass it on to Griffins now to walk us through what we found over the last couple of years.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bjorn. Good evening, everyone. As Bjorn has just presented or introduced me, I'm Griffins. I'm from Kenya. And I would want to present to you the data that IPEN has been able to generate in terms of the link between health, chemicals, and plastics. And this data is from Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. Next slide. So first, maybe to introduce to you IPEN. IPEN is a global network with a mission for a toxics-free future for all. And we are a member organization of more than 660 NGOs across all the regions from 127 countries, as well as IPEN has 25 years or over 25 years experience in negotiations of treaty, started with the Stockholm Convention on POPs, as well as the Minamata Convention, and also the SICAM, the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management. So the map shows the regions where IPEN participating organizations are from, including my organization in Nairobi, Kenya. Next slide. So this diagram shows the life cycle of plastic from extraction, which is the fossil fuels, to the production of the plastic as a product, as you can see, as well as the use, which we normally use in terms of the different types of product of plastics, and how we manage that, manage in terms of, for example, plastic fuel, waste fuel dumping, and global waste shipping. So that diagram just shows you the life cycle of how plastic is managed from extraction to dumping. Next slide. And so my presentation will show the work, the data that IPEN has generated, looking at the first phase, which is in the production of pellets. And in that, IPEN has been able to collect data from 22 coastal locations across Africa, America, Asia, Europe. And the findings of this is that over 100, or rather 100% of these pellets contained PCBs, as well as UV stabilizers, which is also one of the candidates under the discussion under the Stockholm Convention. 50% of the locations had highly or extremely high level PCB levels. So that report demonstrates, or rather generated the data on the production of plastic, which is the first phase of the life cycle of plastic in terms of material life cycle. Next slide. The second phase, I want to present to you on the production of plastic material products. This is the material in the product itself. And this data showed the bisphenol A, which was found in baby bottles, as well as, and the data we generated is that over 78 or over 70% of the products tested had this BPA. 60% of the samples were actually labeled BPA free. And they actually contain the BPA, bisphenol A. So this data was generated from the countries that are listed, and this shows you in terms of the material product, because one of the discussions we have to discuss in this treaty is the definition of plastic, whether a material or a product. So this data will help you give you this kind of information. Next slide. Another second phase, we're still looking at the issue of material product, and we looked at the PFAS as been presented by Trasande in terms of in the clothing materials. And this one we tested different clothing materials made of, and 84% of them materials that were tested contained PFAS. This data was collected from China, Indonesia, and Russia. Next slide. When we look at the life cycle of the diagram, we're now looking at the issues of the recycled materials, or rather the recycled pellets that are used in making other different types of products. When we tested the recycled pellets, we found that they contain the flame retardants, the bisphenol A, and UV stabilizers. And these pellets, recycled pellets, were collected from 24 locations across Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. 100%, all the samples contained one or more of the three substances that I just mentioned, the bisphenol A, the flame retardants, and UV stabilizers. 84% of the samples in all the contain all the three substances, which are already mentioned as potential endocrine disrupting chemicals. Next slide. The other, looking at those recycled products, the material products, we found that the chemicals in the recycled plastic products, 100% of the materials tested showed banned chemicals, which are brominated flame retardants. And these are different types, the Penta, the Dakar, and the Octa, HCBDC. This data was collected from China, Indonesia, and this shows at the production phase of plastic, the kind of chemicals that we have in terms of the recycled material products. Next slide. And the final phase, which looked at the recycled materials or material products, we looked at the brominated flame retardants, and these are recycled plastic products. 72% of the products that we tested from the countries that included Kenya, Gabon, Jordan, and the countries listed there contained, over 72% of them had these brominated flame retardants that exceeded over 50% or 50 ppm of the POPs waste. And this is a discussion that also currently within the Stockholm Convention in terms of handling of POP waste and the chemicals that we are in that. So 9 of the 83 samples had high levels of brominated dioxin levels that are dangerous. Next slide. So this slide shows this peer-reviewed report that showed that recycled plastic toys can, expose children to dioxin. And this is really, has been mentioned from the previous presenter, is a case that need to be, taken into context. And these are the kind of products, that, or that you've seen a number of Rubik cubes that children play with. And these are the kind of recycled material products that contain material plastic that contain the kind of chemicals that expose the children. Next slide. On the end life, the final phase, looking at the end life management of plastic products, we talk about toxic emissions and releases, both at the local level. And we tested different products, rather eggs, as a bioindicator of the dioxin levels, especially in areas where plastic waste is banned. And this is data that was reviewed since 2000, where we have waste incineration, open burning, which is very common in many developing countries, and handling, particularly within the dam sites or landfills, as well as cement kilns, among others. And the data of the eggs we collected were sample from different regions, Africa, Asia, and America. And 92% of the egg samples near the incinerators or the dumping sites contained dioxins above the EU health standards. So these reports are, next slide. And this data has also been reviewed, actually just released the other day, that showed the emissions and the and releases from toxic emissions, especially in the handling of the end of life management of plastic products. So we monitor the dioxins, and the PCB in eggs are sensitive indicators of environmental pollution. That peer-reviewed report is available. I think it was just released last week. Next slide. So in summary, I just want to mention that out of these studies that we've just, the data that we've generated, we conclude that plastic poisons the circular economy. Even as we talk about the circular economy, it has to be free of toxics in order to and you look at the aspect of plastic recycling vis-a-vis recycling of the toxic, we're just saying about recycling toxic chemicals. So this really affects the circular economy. Next slide. So I want to thank you and show you the data. These all reports are available with us here. We brought them, so you can pick copies and read more and learn. But it just give you a summary of the kind of data that IPEN has been able to generate on the issue of chemicals, health, and plastic. Thank you very much.
So as Griffin's pointed out, there's a lot of data. To generate this data is not easy. Plastics are not labeled with these chemicals in the products. So we have to work within the network in over 45 countries to take materials, send them to laboratories, the pellets, Tokyo University, many of the plastics to another university in the Czech Republic and Holland, to have certified labs give us the data, what's in the materials. So this is a large breadth of information. We do have a flyer here with a website that has most of these reports if you'd like to access them in multiple languages. But how do you take the scientific data and the notice of the harm, all that scientific information, and move it into a policy conversation to best inform you all delegates about what decisions to make? And that gets us into what is plastic pollution and defining that. And for IPEN's perspective, we look at it as a health perspective. So from that, we've tried to simplify this. First showing you, if you look at the globe right now, the major plastic producers are not in Latin America nor Africa, but the harms are across the globe and severe health harms. So what we've attempted to do is share with you a 2-minute animation from the perspective of Africa, what public interest organizations and IPENs are shooting for. So with that, we'd like to show you a short 3-minute animation that kind of tells the stories of this data and what we're looking at. So if we can begin with that.
Hazardous chemicals are entering Africa in plastics. In Senegal, Bintou cooks an egg for her son Ismaila. In Bintou's town, plastic waste is burned in the open. When plastic waste is burned, it pollutes the air with toxic chemicals. These chemicals fall into surrounding soils, poisoning the chickens and their eggs. When Bintu serves this egg to Ismaila, she has no idea how much damage it might cause. Where did all this plastic waste come from? Most of it comes from other countries under the guise of recycling. But hazardous chemicals are also exported to Africa, embedded in new plastic products. In South Africa, Lubanzi buys a toy for his daughter Kaya. What he doesn't know is that even some brand new plastics can have toxic chemicals in them. Many countries regulate the hazardous chemicals in this toy, but don't regulate what goes into exported products. Kaya's new toy contains BPA, phthalates, and flame retardants. These toxins are absorbed by Kaya's body as she plays with it. While the plastic industry insists their products are safe, only about 1% of the chemicals on the market today have been tested for toxicity. Global plastic production is growing rapidly and is expected to triple over the next 30 years. Unfortunately, research has shown that many of these chemicals can cause serious health problems. These chemicals are linked to cancer, developmental and neurological damage, and reproductive harm such as infertility. African families and government officials assume new plastic products are safe, but have very little access to information about the toxic chemical additives used to make the plastics. Once these chemicals enter in plastic products or plastic waste, the problem grows. Unfortunately, recycling plastics is not a solution. It can be employed to enable hazardous waste dumping in Africa. Investments to turn plastics into fuel or burning it create further health and climate problems. So how can we protect Africa and Africans? First, we need global controls on hazardous chemicals in plastics. We need to end foreign recycling efforts that export their hazardous plastic waste and hold the plastics producers responsible for the hazardous chemicals they add to their products. We need exporters and African leaders to stop the flow of hazardous plastic and plastic waste into African countries and protect the health of all Africans. Africa's future must be protected.
So that's our attempt to help communicate the data that we generate because no one's telling us what's inside the plastics. That's the only way that we can do that. And so for this, we see this as an important opportunity for a treaty that's to end plastic pollution as really a treaty that relates to chemicals and relates to public health, which of course is the theme of our next panel discussion, which provides me the opportunity to introduce the IPEN co-chair, Dr. Teresa Mer from Ethiopia, Darmis Karan, the senior advisor for the Swiss Ministry of Environment, Valentina Sierra from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Uruguay, and Key Owen Woodland from the BRS Secretariat to begin a conversation about how do we think about the treaty and how do we address this in the conversation. So with that, I will pass it on to IPEN co-chair to lead this conversation, and I hope the microphones work, and if they don't, we can share with these ones. Okay.
Thank you very much, Bjorn. Thank you, everyone, for attending this. We have a couple of questions as a panel, and we will proceed according to the seating order. My first point will be to discuss on how can the plastics treaty help control the use and exposure to hazardous chemicals in the life cycle of plastics. So the three of you will reflect on that, and the first reflection is from Damaris. Damaris, please.
Is this working? Yeah, it is. Fantastic. So how can the plastic treaty help us tackle this issue? And I would like first to thank IPEN and all the presenters before me, because I think one of the things that this process I'm hoping will achieve is raise awareness for the issue and contribute to educate people. Because of course, a treaty process, an intergovernmental process will take time, but action needs to start now. And I think the outstanding work that IPEN is doing with its network is really contributing to this. So my warm thanks, even though sometimes I would like to be, the more data we get, the more scary it becomes. So yeah, I have mixed feelings about this information. But concretely, I think the treaty can help us in different ways. First, in the objectives of the treaty. Certainly, we need to make sure that plastic pollution does not harm human health and the environment. And I think this is a key thing that we'll need to do. Then, of course, we'll need to tackle this issue through the control measures. This can happen in different ways. You know that the mandate talks about voluntary and legally binding measures. This can happen through the bans of some plastic or some substance, or phasing out, and this can also be achieved throughout standards. I think we need much more standards across the life cycle, also to ensure transparency. As we've seen, it's very difficult for people to know what is contained in plastics, and there's much work that needs to be done. I also think that another way that we're going to be able to achieve this is through the implementation and compliance of the treaty, because we need to control, it needs to be implemented at the national level, it needs to be implemented by a number of stakeholders. And then we'll need to continue to have the documentation, the necessary documentation for the negotiators. And I think the work IPEN is doing is extremely useful, but we also need to continue to have research. And I think then the partnership between different stakeholders, between different organizations, we know that BRS is also working on this, the WHO, and I think we need to partner in this because it's important we get the data, and it's important that we raise awareness more on this issue, including, for example, on circular economy and what does it mean specifically for a product like plastic, and the fact that it cannot be recycled endlessly, and the whole chemicals and health issue across the life cycle. This is something that will need to be duly taken into account by negotiators.
Thank you very much, Damaris. It's really very important to take this as a health chemicals issue and toxics-free circular economy. And one of the points that I also take is if we go as to the envisaged process, the treaty will come into implementation in 2029, after 2029, and we are just in 2022. So working on the issues starting from now is a very important issue rather than waiting for 7-8 years from now on. So that's really a very good point that I also take on. Valentina, what is your reflection on this?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for being here present and also the ones that are online. And I would like to especially thank IPEN for all the information that is being provided. Close. Okay, sorry. For all the information that we constantly receive, and I think it's very important to have a clear picture on all the risks, of plastic pollution and the impacts on human health and the environment. And I also want to start talking about the UNEA 5.2. And also we heard that it was the most important it was like historic UNEA and the most successful, and we have to agree indeed with that. We agree on starting a negotiating process to tackle plastic pollution, including on the marine environment, and address it throughout the full life cycle of plastics. And we have an ambitious goal to finish our work in 2024. So we have a lot of work ahead, and we're confident that we will achieve it. And also to answer to your question, I would like to start mentioning some of the main elements that are in the resolution that are relevant for the chemical cluster. in general. First of all, it's important to highlight the recognition of the problem that is on the resolution and their negative impacts on the environment, on human health, and also the social and economic dimension of the sustainable development. Also, it's important to emphasize the dimension of plastic pollution prevention and also its related risks to human health, as well as the adverse effects on human well-being and on the environment, as we said. We also consider that negative impacts on human health, on the environment, and on human rights should be reflected more clearly in the future agreement. Also, the resolution recognizes that plastic pollution needs to be tackled through the life cycle approach. But we still need to have a common understanding of what do we mean by life cycle of plastic. And I think these multi-stakeholder dialogues that we are having today, and also the multi-stakeholder forum that we will have on the INC1, it is a great opportunity to learn more. And that's why we encourage all stakeholders to participate, including the private sector. We need to have a deep understanding on how the plastic sector works, how the life cycle is like, where the producers and consumers are located, as well as the geographic scope that is involved in the plastic waste management. We also encourage the participation of NGOs, a wide participation without restriction during all the process. We also encourage the BRS Secretariat participation, as well as the SICOM Secretariat participation. Of course, participation of the academia, the scientists, the health and labor sector, workers and informal workers, and youth representatives. We really encourage all of you to get involved. And finally, I don't want to take all the time, but we believe that plastic pollution includes health and environment impacts, negative impacts, and hazardous chemicals are used during the production stage, during the consumption, and during waste management. So we should discuss this in the negotiations, and we should consider it in the future treaty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Valentina. You touched lots of things from environmental, social, and the economic aspects and the life cycle approach. And yeah, it's true that the UNIA 5.2 was a very great success to start this process and to come up with this OEWG. And also the human rights aspect of the plastics pollution and in the life cycle process is also something that we should also consider. And we should not only focus on the visible aspect and the invisibles, the chemical aspects, the human health aspects, and the toxic recycling circular economy aspect should also be considered. Thank you very much, Valentina. And Kay?
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to take part of this panel. I would like to mention two things, adding to what was already said. First is gaps in listing. So Dr. Leo have mentioned that PFAS has range of concerned chemicals, of which there are already 3 big sets listed under the Stockholm Convention: PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS, and another set, long-chain PFCAs, their salts and related compounds, is currently under review. And with regard to flame retardants, brominated flame retardants, we had 5 sets already listed: penta-BDE, octa-BDE, deca-BDE, hexabromocyclododecan, hexabromobiphenyl. And then not just only brominated, there is a chlorinated flame retardant, Decloram Plus. This is under review currently, and the POPs review committee already concluded that global action is warranted for this chemical because of its hazardousness. And so, and then of course PCB, and then UV stabilizer, UV328 is also under review. Dioxins is listed under the convention. But there are chemicals that are not listed under the Stockholm Convention, like phthalates, bisphenol A, nonylphenol A, And what are we going to do with that? And this is what is something not currently addressed under the Stockholm Convention, and it could be something that considered. Another about flame retardants. So when the industry starts searching for alternatives, there are other flame retardants that might become of concern, like phosphate-based flame retardants, which is not currently the main ones. But once you start banning brominated flame retardants, those will come. And then, you know, in that time, how do we, convention, be resilient to address those newly, you know, emerging substances? So one is this gaps in listing. Another one is labeling. It is very important to ensure transparency and traceability of these substances of concern throughout life cycle of plastics, because this will help consumers to make informed decision. You can choose the products, and this will also make the industry, the manufacturers, to become more responsible in selecting which chemicals to use. This will also help waste stream, recycling stream, you know, to help sorting if we have more stronger labeling system, enhanced traceability and transparency in the information on chemicals in plastics. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Those chemicals that are under discussion within POPROC, and a question also comes, what are we going to do with those chemicals which are not under discussion with the POPROC? So this is something also for the process to go through it. And the three main important things also with the industry, which is raised by Key, is labeling, transparency, and traceability. This is something that we should also focus on chemicals in products and chemicals in plastics, on how to handle and how to deal with them. So these are very important take-home points, and also take-home points for the future process of this OEWG and the INCs that are going to come. Thank you. My second question is, what guiding principles should be adopted to achieve an non-toxic circular economy for plastics? We raised non-toxic circular economy because if we deal with circular economy, as a point, what comes in is coming out. So if it is toxic, toxics in, toxics out, and that will not be a proper solution. Here comes the health aspect and also the environmental aspect and human rights aspect. So how are we going to deal with this? Damaris.
Thank you very much. And I think a number of issues have already been mentioned, but I want to emphasize something that Valentina also said. First, there's need to be a recognition that we believe circular economy needs to be safe and non-toxic. And I think this is already a first step in our discussion, is making sure that then we don't let those products or chemicals that we think are not fit for circular economy, like in the first place. So I think this will be a very important element. And then I think we have all highlighted this. It's transparency, traceability. We need a lot more of this at every stages. Because of course, when we see the data of recycled material then being produced, and then we have toys made of recycled plastic, and then if they're full of chemicals, this is of course an issue of concern. So I think this on this much more transparency on and labeling of the products will be key. And I think Kay mentioned this. It's also very important that we make sure we enhance synergies with other processes, and we can also discuss this in the next set of questions, but we make sure that there's no duplication. It was mentioned some chemicals are already prohibited, so we need to make sure that implementation and compliance is being done. But then for the rest, we need to see how best to tackle this. We all have limited resources, so it's very important that we set up a process that is also meaningful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it goes back to the transparency, traceability, and labeling. And by circular economy, it's emphasized that it should not be toxic. When we are talking about circular economy, it should not be toxic. And the collaboration and the synergy between other agreements like the OPS agreement, the Stockholm Convention, if Stockholm Convention enforces all the articles in the plastics, that will also force the circular economy to be clean. So that's a point that we can take and also discuss during this process. Valentina?
Yes, in addition of what Damaris said, also I think that this resolution has very important elements that need to be further developed in the treaty as guiding principles. For instance, the sustainable production and consumption of plastics is very relevant for us. Also the sound management of waste and circular economy. These are, well, actually 4 elements that are already included, but we consider that we need to develop further on the discussions. Then, well, we heard today in the multi-stakeholder dialogues, I think it was the 3rd speaker, there were the how do you say it in English, the recyclers. So I think it's very relevant to include them during all the process. And also this resolution recognize, it literally recognize the workers that are under informal settings and cooperative settings. And we as Uruguay, we always support the informal workers, also under the ILO, International Labour Organization, the negotiations. And we want to see also in the treaty very strong message for them. In addition, we also heard that chemicals in plastics, hazardous chemicals in plastics cannot be recycled. I mean, we really need to address that issue because it's very, very dangerous for health. We also saw it just recently in the presentation that was made virtually. And also, in that sense, we consider that we need to phase down or phase out, eliminate as much as possible the hazardous and toxic chemicals from all the life cycle of plastics. Also, well, for that, we do need more clarity, and all these assessments that were made by IPEN are also very helpful, and we need to communicate it further. Also, we have to take into account the sustainable alternatives and technologies, and also to highlight the need for enhanced international collaboration to facilitate access to those technologies, capacity building, and also scientific and technical cooperation. Also, we need to identify the existing gaps in international law, but I think that's going to be later discussed, so I will leave it for now.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the multi-stakeholder approach of all actors in the whole life cycle process is a very important point, and the phasing out and phasing down of hazardous chemicals in plastics, which we envisage that this will also be part of the INC process and probably the annexes like the Stockholm Convention that will also support, and sustainable alternatives. Sustainable alternatives is also one thing. If not plastics, so what? Will also be the process that we are going to have a discussion in the coming years. Thank you very much, Valentina. Key?
Right, so thank you for the opportunity. Adding to what was already said, I mean, when does plastic become toxic? What does it mean by non-toxic circular economy? Plastics become toxic during the manufacturing phase, when you add toxic additives or you also use chemicals in processing as processing aid. So plastics become not toxic during manufacturing phase, and therefore it is important that design and have sustainability criteria that could be applicable to industry so that plastics will not become toxic. And then there's already lots of plastics in the world. That's legacy plastics. You also have to deal with those. Then, my second point is that sorting, and when you would like to recycle back, dematerialize plastics and try to use plastic back again for another product, do not put that toxic chemical containing plastic back to market. So those two, I think, are the main stages to avoid plastic circular economy to be non-toxic. Thanks.
Thank you very much. When we look at the life cycle approach, from cradle to cradle, if we see plastics as products, we will be engaged only on the waste management aspect. But if we are dealing on materials, we are also dealing with the designing aspect, where the plastics are coming from, and that's where we can deal also with green designing. By green designing, we will either minimize or cut the use of hazardous chemicals. Replacing hazardous chemicals with less or non-toxic chemicals in the production process will be one aspect also that Key raised. Thank you very much. And my final and third question is with regards to the first point that Key raised on the link between this plastics treaty and other treaties, especially the Stockholm Convention and also Basel Convention. So what are the existing laws and gaps in international law in relation to recycling plastics with hazardous chemicals for Stockholm Convention and trading of plastic waste in relation to Basel Convention? I come to you again.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad that in the end, Kay will be able also to say, give us also more details on this. I think what we need to get more clarity in while we're going to negotiate this process, what are the legal gaps and what are the implementation issue, and these are two different things, and because then it will also help us to assess what are the real gaps, for example, and what needs to be strengthened, for example, in the implementation framework in the context of BRS. And then see how best and where it's most suited to do things. But I think it's clear, and it was highlighted that in terms of global standards, improving coherence and transparency, this is where I think there's almost nothing at the international level in terms of product design, etc. So I think this is where it's for sure that the upcoming treaty can make a good contribution. I think now we need to become more granular in terms of how we can work with the different treaty and go beyond the no duplication synergies discussion. And I'm glad that there are already some projects going on in that regard, like on chemicals and plastic governance, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Two big points. What are the legal gaps? And the second one is implementation issues. What are the implementations that we are focusing on? And this also comes to the point that the three of you raised. What are we dealing with? What are plastics? Understanding what plastics are. The first thing is that, what do we mean by plastics? Or what are we going to manage? That is the question that we'll answer with the legal gaps and also with the implementation issues. Valentina?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think Damaris raised very good points. And in addition to that points, we would like to raise the importance of identifying the potential that Stockholm Convention and Basel Convention had, and also the work that is already done under those conventions. We don't need to duplicate efforts. We don't need, we just need coordinated approaches. We need coherence. We need complementarity, as the resolution of UNEFI resolution highlighted. And in that sense, we would like also to point that under Basel Convention, we made a very good work. We really, in the COP, in the 2019 COP, we had two very important resolutions on the amendment of the annexes that include the plastic waste, hazardous plastic waste under the convention, and also we start the plastic waste partnership. So we had some way that we work for many years under Basel Convention, but we also need to explore what else Basel Convention can do on this issue. So the potential that both conventions have. Also, I think that it's very important to coordinate efforts among the secretariats, not only the BRS secretariat, but other MEA secretariats, also to avoid the duplication of efforts. And also, a very important message that I want to give is the human rights aspect. Recently, the Human Rights Council adopts and internationally recognizes the human right to a healthy environment, a safe environment. So that is needed also to be recognized in the MEAs and in this future plastic treaty. Also, the human right to health, the human right to life, among others, are very important and needed to be highlighted. Also, we had in this resolution the urgent need to enhance, to strengthen the science policy interface, and also it opens the possibility to establish a scientific committee under this treaty. We consider that is very important. We totally support it, but we also consider that we will have a parallel negotiation on the SPP, the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution. So we also need to take advantage of that panel that will be created, and the negotiations will be parallel, as I said. Because they will see the problem and they will have all the umbrella. And maybe we could also make best use of this panel also and ask for scientific assessments. And finally, well, of course, we agree on the importance of the implementation, and for us it's fundamental to develop and to enhance national plans, national action plans. We also recognize that it's not the only solution because it's a global problem, so we need to have to take into account many other implementation ways. But of course, it's fundamental for developing countries to have a capacity building technical assistance and to have a strong financial mechanism for the best implementation of the future treaty. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. You touched lots of things, starting from what has been done in the previous COPs, like the amendment, which included also the plastic waste management and the plastic waste management coalition within the Basel Convention. That's one thing. And the discussion which has been going on before this meeting in different arenas is also avoiding duplication of efforts in many conventions. That should also be discussed in this process. You repeatedly raised the human rights aspect, and that's really very valid. And it should also be noted in this meeting. One potential also opportunity is the science policy panel, which is coming on, and we heard about the endocrine disruptive chemicals in plastics and other scientific aspects. So if this is also incorporated and presented from the science policy panel, it will have a weight. National action plans and capacities in developing countries, the financial mechanisms, because plastics are produced by big financial hands, and how we handle all those. And also even for the designing, green designing, and also eliminating all that. We should have also a financial mechanism, and that should, where the finance is coming, who is responsible, who is paying for what? Is it the public, is it the industry, or what is the mechanism should also be raised. Yeah, thank you very much, Valentina.
Right, thank you very much. So BRS Secretariat, we have done some analysis on how the conventions, where the convention provisions are relevant to possibly the consideration on this new global treaty. And this is included in the OEWG INF3 document. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And also we have it summarized in a little bit more readable manner, and it's over there, so please pick it up for details. But indeed, the implementation is quite important. The ad hoc open-ended working group on marine litter and microplastics concluded that status quo is not acceptable because plastic pollution is so imminent. But then Basel Convention has been there for so many years with the clear pillar that transboundary movement of hazardous waste and other wastes needs to be controlled. Waste needs to be managed in an environmentally sound manner, right? Prevention and minimization of the generation of waste. Those are already in the Basel Convention, but this is not clearly applied to plastic waste. And that is why parties agreed in 2019 to clarify the scope of plastic waste applicable to Basel Convention. So since 2019, parties to the convention already has tools to implement, eliminate generation, minimization of plastic waste, right? Environmental sound management. But again, implementation, capacity building, financial and human resource assistance, these things will not come in one day. And then agreeing on convention is not the goal. Another example is Stockholm Convention. It lists PCB as one of the 12 dozens of chemicals. But PCB, in some countries, you have eliminated successfully. But in many countries, it is still continue to be a problem. There's a goal to eliminate PCB by 2025 and implement environmentally sound waste management of PCB by 2028. When this convention was adopted, 2025 was, achievable goal. But then again, it's almost like tomorrow, right? So indeed, implementation, financial mechanism, support, capacity building, these will continue to be one of the most critical. Enforcement is really, really important. Having compliance mechanism, extremely important. And I think that the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions have good experience, lessons learned, best practices that we could offer in this consideration. Not just only, the provisions are maybe overlapping and so on, but maybe other areas like we have effectiveness evaluation that needs to be implemented in the Stockholm Convention. So those details are in this little brochure over there. Please pick it up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Thank you very much. This treaty has a lot to learn from the BRS Convention in developing annexes and also how the implementation process goes and all the experiences also on this issue. The financial mechanisms, the capacity building, and human resources aspect of especially developing nations, and the implementation aspect is a very vital issue raised repeatedly. Having said this, I would like to thank all my panelists, Damaris, Valentina, and Key. Thank you so very much. It's a very good discussion that gives also input for the next days and the couple of years discussion in the process of this treaty formation. Thank you very much. I would like to give my thanks to all the audience, and I give the floor to Bjorn to to take us to the next.
I'd like to thank the UNEP agency for allowing us to convene this program, which was not on the program initially. We believe the content's very important for all conversations going forward, as well as multi-stakeholder dialogues. I'd also like to thank UNEP for their patience as this program ran over due to our logistical challenge. So we just recognize that. And to conclude, we really see a plastics treaty as a health treaty. We really see health as a critical part for the health of the planet, as well as the health of human beings and future generations. So with that, without saying more data is available online, more content is available, and this recording will also be online with the Geneva Environment Network's Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues. So with that, we conclude this event, and thank you all very much. Thank you.